happens to the average American? What happens to any of you? If the courts in New York come after any of you because of something you said, because you said something the ruling class didn't like. And that's what all these other countries are about. They shut down the ruling class. They want to be sure that anyone that speaks up against the ruling class disappears. They want Donald Trump to disappear. They want to send him to jail. They want to take him off the main stage because they know here's their biggest danger to taking the ruling class down. No, you know why? Donald Trump is not the ruling class.
Would a member of the ruling class be facing 730 years in prison? What a pathetic question. 730 years in prison, and he's a member of the elite? That's pathetic. You're not a journalist.
So I...
Yes, folks. Left Reckoning 170. Taking on the ruling class, Matt. Happy to be doing it with you again this week. That was a real treat, I must say. Been a while since I've heard that Gorka voice speak truth to power.
You're not a journalist. I'm a PhD also. By the way, look at Gorka. Search Gorka Graph PhD if you want a funny Google image search.
Wait, what was that?
It was like this oval that had like terrorism. I guess I'll have to bring it up now. But yeah, his sort of thesis leaked online, and it turns out he's a big time charlatan.
That was the little governor, the lieutenant governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, showing off his radio. There again, talking about one of the most powerful people in world, former President Donald Trump, a billionaire, as somebody who's standing up to the ruling class. Truly incredible gymnastics. And as you noted, Matt, it's very funny to see him sort of get tripped up because even deep down, he knows what he's saying. This is truly ridiculous. But
this is the Gorka map, or the graph I'm talking to. Peacekeeping and thermonuclear war above an arrow that points only to the right, and then terrorism in an oval, and with arrows pointing to the left and to the right toward question marks. So that is his grad student PhD. That is diagram 9, terrorism and the scale of conflict. So very useful stuff there from Sebastian Gorka.
Make me always a man who questions. I love the humility there from from this figure. I mean, truly, it's been wild, and we haven't really done too much of the Trump trial on this program. But one thing that is notable is how much time Texas elected officials are spending in New York City accompanying Donald Trump.
Buddy, it is not just Texas. I love like all those guys in the blue and red ties talking about the ruling class. Speaking of the ruling class, the North Dakota's ruling class is also in the Big Apple to show support for Donald Trump. Doug Burgum, who did not run as a Republican in North Dakota, ran as an independent businessman, and then just ultimately like couldn't resist the gravity and was basically governed as a Republican. Was here talking about, I think, like the air conditioning or something like that, and how unfair it was to Trump, which is also a side effect of Ozempic, is it's a little bit drafty. But Doug Burgum, yeah, like, bro, go back home. Why are you in New York City? And it's pretty wild to see that.
All I hope is that we're not paying for that. I would love to get an investigation as to whether or not we have been.
It's a good question. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene even posed it to Mike Johnson. Like, who's paying for that? And like, that's a good question for anybody who has. Honestly, like, it really. There's so much shit going on. Obviously, like the Democrats are doing a genocide with Biden right now. But what's going on with the Republican Party is just really insane to have all these guys fly out like sycophants to this guy's court dates instead of when really what people should be doing is seizing an opportunity. It's really basic. And I'll just remind people, Doug Burgum is a billionaire because of Bill Gates. He sold a business to Bill Gates. That's why he's a billionaire. So yeah, I mean, he might think he's going to be Trump's vice president. I don't think he's going to be Trump's vice president.
Vaxxed. Yeah, I mean, it is something that's true. I mean, look, it's full on campaign season right now, and one thing that we know about Donald Trump is he likes a loyalist. So all these folks are trying to make sure that they're in the photo so that maybe when Donald Trump makes those VP or Attorney General picks, if he gets elected again, that he might think of them. So it'll be interesting to
And
see these
Nome,
guys. Yeah.
Kristi Noem in South Dakota took her campaign or VP hopes to the proverbial gravel pit and put them down with the revelation that she killed a dog in her book. Just decided to talk about killing dogs and stuff. So she's out the paint. Elise Stefanik in New York is talking about, don't forget what I said in 2015 about Trump being demeaning to women. I want to be his VP now, but you're from New York. Like, I don't know. I think it's going to be JD Vance. But we'll have more time to talk about that.
Well, we'll have to see. And like, I'm not saying this person is necessarily would take it or pursuing it, but he definitely wants to be in the conversation, and that is the Texas governor, Greg Abbott, who we're going to talk about in just a second. In a minute, we're going to be joined by our good buddy Ryan Zickgraf, who is a columnist at Compact Magazine, to talk about his new piece in Jackman Magazine about white rural rage. The latest installment in big city liberals getting worked up about poor people in the country. It was really nice having him on. And then a little bit later in the program, we're going to be talking about Red Lobster and how it might not have been the all-you-can-eat shrimp promotion that sunk it. It might be a more classic story about American capitalism and some of the nasty financial interests that run it. So you don't want to miss any of those bits or the post game.
But I want to blame the people. I don't want to blame capitalists.
The hungry people. Yeah. And then, of course, you can join us in the post game, patreon.com/leftreckoning to get access to the bonus episode. Matt and I are going to be talking a little bit about Crowder. You won't want to miss
Steven Crowder has some commentary on the ICC warrants out for BB and
international newsman Steven Crowder.
Yeah. And Crowder's analysis is that it's gay and doesn't matter, but also a threat to like the future freedom of the world. So we'll be looking in on that, as well as a little bit of history of Steven Crowder doing his. I really want to put a target on Christian Zionists in this country, big time weirdos. I want to really go after them, and Steven Crowder is going to be the mascot, I think, for that endeavor.
Yeah, we'll see how long that's popular. But let's talk about this, Matt, because some very unfortunate news out of the state of Texas. Last week, Texas Governor Greg Abbott pardoned Daniel Perry, somebody who's a convicted murderer. It's the latest in a long string of extremely worrying developments about law and order in the state of Texas. Particularly, what's really worrying about this case is the nature of how law in the state is being used or not used to support the political ambitions of people like Greg Abbott, the intentions of the Republican Party, watching our constitutional rights, like the right to bear arms, seem to only guarantee certain Texans have those rights, and a continued concentration of power in the hands of the governor of Texas. And now, what we've seen with this pardon of Daniel Perry, frankly, an implicit endorsement of violence against our fellow Texans. This is no small thing. But before we get into all of this, let's take a second and take ourselves back to that time. July 2020, in Austin, Texas, much like the rest of the country, Americans are taking to the streets and demanding that justice be done, and that the brutality by the police against our brothers and sisters end, and demanding change. While this is ongoing, U.S. Army Sergeant Daniel Perry was driving for Uber when he drove into a Black Lives Matter protest near the Capitol. First, he honked his horn at this group of protesters and then drove his vehicle into the protesters. This is not just hearsay, right? This is according to the report from the Austin police. And I really want people to remember what the context of this moment was like, what this country was going through at this time, because there is an eerie similarity here between what happened in 2020 and something that happened in 2017, where in Charlottesville, Virginia, a young thug named James Alex Fields Jr. drove his vehicle into a group of protesters in Charlottesville, injuring 35 people, permanently injuring 8, and killing Heather Heyer. So when we talk about somebody driving their vehicle into protesters, this isn't just a kind of random complaint. This is something that has been a life and death threat to protesters. And we're seeing, again, as everybody knows, too, all of these attempts by Republicans to make it legal, to waive responsibility for people behind the wheel if they drive their vehicle into protesters. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and you look at the Charlottesville thing, and I saw somebody comment like, I can't remember. The commentary was very minimizing of what happened in Charlottesville. You actually look at what happened.
Oh my God, it's
and
horrifying.
it is shocking that it only killed one person. Just barreling into a group of people with the effing car. And again, and this is in the context of Dakota Access Pipeline, North Dakota Republicans passing laws saying, if they're in the road, you can hit them. Like that's they're a threat to you. It's really fascism.
As we see this, right, as this is the context of what's going on at the time. As this happens, as this vehicle plows into protesters, Garrett Foster, who was there illegally carrying a rifle, AK-47, which in Texas, by the way, is not only completely legal, in fact, de facto encouraged by our government as they continue to push stronger and stronger protections for people to carry all sorts of weapons in all kinds of circumstances. He died shortly after this because Daniel Perry took out a loaded revolver and fired 5 shots, killing Garrett Foster. Perry claimed that this was in self-defense, and importantly, maintained and told the police that he shot Foster, quote, before Foster aimed his weapon at him, right? This is a really critical detail because the right-wing spin machine from people like Tucker Carlson to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, we just saw at the beginning of the show, have been trying to make this implication that the story went like this. A young man was driving his vehicle down the road. A group of people surrounded his vehicle and started, attacking him. And then somebody came up with a rifle and pointed at his face and he fired in self-defense. No, what happened was Daniel Perry, and we'll talk about his motivations in just a second. Daniel Perry drove his vehicle into a group of protesters. Somebody was there who was legally armed, which is your right in the state of Texas, and something that you see in protest after protest for the right wing, or small groups of right wingers who will stand outside of these kind of protests trying to intimidate folks. And yet somebody who's saying, hey, I want to make sure that the group of people I'm with are protected and safe, then somehow it becomes dangerous and malicious and all this kind of stuff. Very important, though, that the spin that we get from people like Carlson and Dan Patrick is not accurate. The case went to trial, and by a jury of his peers, Daniel Perry was found guilty of the murder of Garrett Foster. And in that trial, he had every opportunity to put forward the case that he was acting in self-defense. In fact, that's what him and his team of lawyers did. And this jury was not convinced that Daniel Perry was innocent, and in fact, actively went out searching for trouble. The right-wing press went absolutely bananas and wanted to utilize the story of Daniel Perry, who, by the way, we mentioned that he was a U.S. Army sergeant. Garrett Foster was also a member of the United States Air Force, right? But this person who the right-wing likes was, the latest victim of an overzealous liberal conspiracy to basically silence law and order respecting Americans and Texans. When nothing could be further from the truth. But here's Tucker Carlson just shortly after Daniel Perry was convicted of murder.
So during the last outbreak of armed extremism, which of course was the BLM riots of 2020, a former Army sergeant called Daniel Perry was driving for Uber in Austin, Texas. He was an Uber driver. He's in his car and a mob of rioters surround him in the middle of the street and begin hitting his car. One member of the mob was a man called Garrett Foster. Foster is a militant with a history of waving his rifle at people. He approached Perry's driver's side window with an AK-47. Then he raised the rifle, and when he did that, Perry shot and killed him in self-defense. The lead detective in the case and the Austin police concluded it was a justified shooting. If that's not a justified shooting, there's no such thing. But because Austin, Texas, the justice system is overseen by a Soros-funded DA, Perry was charged with murder for defending himself. And tonight, we are sad to tell you, this man, a military veteran driving an Uber car, was convicted of murder. And what does that mean? It means that in the state of Texas, if you have the wrong politics, you're not allowed to defend yourself. So this is a legal atrocity. It's so obviously unjust that tonight we extended an invitation to the sitting governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, to come on this show on Monday. And we wanted to ask if he was considering a pardon for Daniel Perry. But for some reason, Governor Greg Abbott's office told us he just can't make it and that we should talk to the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, instead. So that is Greg Abbott's position. There is no right of self-defense in Texas. We're going to keep trying to reach the governor of Texas, get his views on that, and the Attorney General for that matter.
And this was something that Tucker Carlson kind of maintained for a while, and over the past year has made Governor Greg Abbott somewhat of a target, saying that he's not doing anything on the border, all this kind of stuff. And the sad reality is that somebody like Greg Abbott completely was happy to acquiesce to somebody like Tucker Carlson on this issue. I want to note two things before we get back to the case. Notice how these right-wingers always talk about Daniel Perry, right? They use the military photograph, all this kind of stuff. But the guy who, again, was a member of the United States Air Force, no military photograph or anything like that, right? He's a dangerous militant. And yet this person who we're about to establish some very unsavory things about, kind of working class hero, put in a dangerous and difficult situation.
Oh yeah, are we going to get to this unsavory stuff? Because I got a few examples here. Once you get going.
Yeah, let's get to that in just 1 second, because I want to establish two quick things here that are very, very important about not just this particular case, but what's been going on in the state of Texas. Because here's the thing: in Texas, the governor does not just get to pardon people. The standard that we have in the state that recognizes the importance of a jury system here in Texas. Texas has strong juries. Because in Texas, we believe that justice is something that should be controlled and done by the people. Now, we do have a pardon system because mistakes are made, things like that. The pardon system goes through a board that makes recommendations to the governor about cases, and then the governor can pardon them after they have been recommended to them by this board. This board is supposed to be non-political, non-partisan, and like many other boards in the state of Texas, because Texas traditionally, constitutionally, has a weak governor system because we don't want to live in a state. Framers of our state constitution did not want to live in a state where you could concentrate all the power in a figurehead in one person, right? We have all kinds of boards for all sorts of aspects of the executive functions in the state of Texas, including this. And what's happened because Greg Abbott has been able to maintain power for so long because of the weakness of the Democratic Party in the state. Greg Abbott has been able to appoint plenty of people, so these boards are filled with loyalists and folks who are loyal to Greg Abbott. And again, this board is only supposed to make these kind of recommendations after seeing that something in the trial was done incorrectly, right? New facts, issues with the prosecution, etc. Greg Abbott was calling on the board to investigate this before he had any ability to look over the case. The case was not public. So before seeing anything that happened in the trial, they were calling it a travesty of justice and all this kind of stuff, literally prejudging the case. This gets us to our main point here, that Greg Abbott is clearly flaunting and making a mockery of our parole system. The government needs to have clear and compelling evidence that something happened in the trial that infringed on Daniel Perry's rights to a fair trial. No one in the government, clearly, in position of power in the government, is interested in stopping Greg Abbott as he does this to our parole system, as he does what he's doing with the National Guard and the state troopers here in Texas, DPS. That the governor has just been able to amass tremendous amounts of executive power. Perry was pardoned not because of an unfair trial or anything. Perry was pardoned because of what he did. And let me say that again. Daniel Perry was not pardoned because injustice was done when a jury of his peers convicted him of murder. Daniel Perry is out on our streets and has been pardoned because of what he did. Because the Republican Party of Texas, people like Greg Abbott, people like Dan Patrick, like the fact that Daniel Perry shot and killed a protester, a Black Lives Matters protester, because it instills fear in everyday Texans. Now, a lot has come out since this trial because there was a lot of information about Daniel Perry's associations, about his internet activity, about his text messages. That was, again, not publicly available, when the verdict came in about the murder trial. A lot of information has come out about Daniel Perry's associations, messages, and activity. I have a few here, Matt. I don't know if you had any that you wanted to add.
This piece from the Texas Tribune, unsealed evidence shows racist comments, threats of violence made by Daniel Perry before killing an Austin protester. I mean, just a few graphs here. On May 20th, and this is going to be some racist imagery read into the record here by yours truly. So just brace yourself for that. On May 29th, 2020, days after George Floyd's murder by a Minneapolis police officer, another thing Tucker Carlson has propagandized with lies about, interesting, prompted nationwide protests. Perry sent a text message saying, quote, "I might go to Dallas to shoot looters." 2 days later, according to it sounds like a Uber driver, just a typical Uber driver thing to be saying. 2 days later, according to the records, Perry said in a Facebook message that when he is in Dallas, quote, "No protesters go near me or my car." Quote, "Can you catch me a Negro daddy?" The other man replied. Perry replied, "That is what I am hoping." In June, Perry sent text messages from an unknown area, detailing bars closing and, quote, "the blacks gathering up in a group. I think something is about to happen." Quote, "I wonder if they will let me cut the ears off people who's decided to commit suicide by me." He also said, "Too bad," in a Facebook group, "Too bad we can't get paid for hunting Muslims in Europe." He said, "This guy is a Nazi." It's not a surprising at all that Tucker Carlson would be going to bat for him because he sounds like the type of person who might write for Tucker Carlson.
And just adding to dehumanization stuff that we got from him, this is somebody who admitted to have killing somebody in Afghanistan when he was in the U.S. military. Says it does not count as a kill because they, quote, "are not people." So this is the kind of individual, these are the kind of views that they had. But the fact is that there's plenty of establishment here that Daniel Perry was not some kind of guy who just happened to be in this situation. This was somebody who was actively seeking out the opportunity to instill terror and cause chaos. And he seized that opportunity when he got the chance.
I mean, it's like, have you seen Taxi Driver?
Yeah.
It's just Uber driver.
Now, we could spend the whole episode, frankly, going through the activity of this guy, other allegations too about his pursuit of young girls, on plenty of other nasty messages about killing protesters. We didn't talk about the monkey stuff that he had said, for example. But the fact of the matter is that a jury of Texans found Perry's claim of self-defense to be insufficient, and that Perry was out intentionally seeking to cause mayhem, and he succeeded. What do I always say about Greg Abbott, Matt? That he likes to operate in the gray area. He likes to subvert the Texas Constitution, for example, sending the National Guard to our border. Imply, but don't assert, don't say it out loud, that Texas is trying to nullify American law, United States law, federal law. And here, talking about standing your ground and the right to bear arms, Abbott is operating in a gray area. Because if the intention of stand your ground laws in Texas, which we do, and this is something that in his pardon, Greg Abbott noted, is that in Texas we have strong stand your ground laws. If the intention of stand your ground laws and our Second Amendment rights is to empower everyday Texans to defend themselves and their loved ones from attack, think about somebody like Garrett Foster right now, who was pushing his black wife in a wheelchair around Congress Avenue to demand justice for our brothers and sisters. And then a vehicle crashed into the crowd after we have seen vehicles used as weapons to kill people at these kind of protests in the past. What rights do we have? The rights, do we have the right to carry? Well, apparently, to Tucker Carlson, to Dan Patrick, to Greg Abbott, we don't have the right to carry if we're with the wrong group of folks. Do we have the right to stand our ground? Apparently not. Right? It creates an extremely volatile and dangerous situation, the way that these laws have been written, the way that they've been put into practice. Because despite all the claims, this is about, an old school version of justice, right? An old school version of being able to stand up for yourself and protect yourself. This is about empowering thugs to terrorize everyday people. Because the effect of these, for example, open carry laws that we have here in the state of Texas aren't about actual gun rights or people's rights to defend themselves from abuses by the government, from threats from criminals. No, it's so that right-wing thugs can stand next to a Black Lives Matter protest armed to the teeth to imply violence, to threaten people, to intimidate people. And right here, what we've seen from our governor here, Greg Abbott, and from the entire Republican Party is a very clear attempt to intimidate and to instill fear in protesters, be it by the police, like we have seen at these Palestinian human rights marches that we've seen, where the police immediately have used brutal violence against folks, including the media, right? To an example like this, where the governor of this state can say, hey, it doesn't matter how clear cut this trial is that somebody killed somebody, that somebody engaged in murder. You kill the right person in the state of Texas, you're free to go. That's a very dangerous precedent for our democracy and for everyday folks here.
And it's done for the propaganda value of it, which tells us how dark of a place we're in,
And let's also the propaganda aspect of it, one on the sense of looking tough for Fox News viewers, looking tough for Donald Trump, because maybe Donald Trump wants to give Greg Abbott a call if he gets elected to do this or that. But also most dangerously and most worryingly, and this is where our attention should be laser focused, it is a propaganda act. It is a wink and a nod to all sorts of violent and dangerous elements in our society to say, hey, if you engage in attacking the people that we don't like, because we don't like protesters in Texas, apparently, right? That's basically what we've been hearing from Patrick and Abbott. You do something, we'll do everything that we can to protect you, no matter how egregious your activities. That is where you see the very fabric of a constitutional democracy begin to unravel before your eyes.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's like the tacit support Israel's government gives to the settlers that destroy aid convoys. For instance, this is fascism, the elites in power, despite they want to resist that, and psychos on the street level, the uneasy relationship between those two, but it is a relationship.
Mm. And we'll keep watching this. I mean, there's been plenty of covered. I highly suggest people read Christopher Hook's writing in Texas Monthly, for example, on this, who's been covering this really well for a while. Austin Police Department, apparently this is news today, had drafted up a letter in support of Daniel Perry. No doubt about it. Why would they do that? Well, it's because they don't like the regularly democratically, somebody who beat the hell out of all the kind of fake challengers that the right and people like Elon Musk backed here. They don't like them. They don't like the elected officials of the Austin area, particularly because those elected officials have been investigating police misconduct and abuse of Austinites. So, yeah, it's not surprising to see those folks lined up with white nationalists and Greg Abbott.
I saw that story. It probably bears dwelling a little bit more that it was a protest against police that this guy killed somebody,
Yeah.
and the cops might not be disinterested in their maybe, even if it was shelved, recommendation that they don't charge this guy.
Yeah, so we'll keep, we'll keep covering this kind of stuff. I just think that it's really important to, one, never let these threats and intimidation stop our movements, and two, to keep your eye on the damn ball when this kind of stuff has been ongoing. Because the thing is, with Abbott in particular, is this has been a slow rolling march to unravel the basic democratic rights here in the state of Texas. An incredibly frightening concentration of power in the executive branch, something that, again, is not the intention of the Texas Constitution, and complete silence and incapability by a lot of people on the left to be able to talk about this coherently too. There needs to be a lot more engagement in this kind of stuff, because this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of future that we'll be left with as long as working class people are out of power in the way that they are here and the way that they are all across this country. So, folks, we're going to jump over to our conversation with Ryan Zickgraf. We're going to talk about rural America, a part of the country that should definitely be a part of our fight for a different future. A part of the country, we didn't mention this in the interview, where we saw significant labor activity over the past few years. I mean, so many of these strikes, so many of these labor actions have been happening in rural America. This is exactly the part of the country where we should be seeing leftists and pro-working class politics growing and thriving. And what better opportunity than right now when liberals are engaged in a nasty, nasty attack against our brothers and sisters in rural America. So we had Ryan Zickgraf on to talk about the most recent example of this, which is white rural rage. So enjoy that conversation. Then Matt and I will be right back with another segment in just a little bit. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
I'm doing good, David. Good to be with you.
Yeah, man. Really stoked to be here today. And we're joined today by Ryan Zickgraf, who is a columnist at Compact Magazine and a return guest on Left Reckoning. And we're here to talk about Ryan's new piece in Jacobin Magazine on white rural rage. Ryan, how you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, man. I mean, this is one of those pieces when I saw the topic and then I saw the writer, I was like, all right, we got to get Ryan on to talk about this, because this book was pretty wild. And I mean, where to even start? I have this video here. Maybe we'll start with this in the author's own words. Let's just set the stage a little bit, because for people who might not be familiar, they might not recognize that, in my opinion, this book is really like the quintessential liberal, anti-rural America, a book where, instead of looking at maybe the reasons that Democrats have been failing in that part of the country, it's the voters who are the problem. But let's just play this quick segment here from MSNBC to set us off.
Background and Donald Trump that the opposite would be true.
I mean, we lay out the fourfold interconnected threat that white rural voters pose to the country. First of all, and we show 30 polls and national studies to demonstrate this. We provide the receipts in Chapter 6. They're the most racist, xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and anti-gay geodemographic group in the country. Second, they're the most conspiracist group. QAnon support and subscribers, election denialism, COVID denialism and scientific skepticism, Obama birtherism. Third, anti-democratic sentiments. They don't believe in an independent press, free speech. They're most likely to say the president should be able to act unilaterally without any checks from Congress or the courts or the bureaucracy. They're also the most strongly white nationalist and white Christian nationalists. And fourth, they are most likely to excuse or justify violence as an acceptable alternative to peaceful public discourse.
So you mentioned.
All right. We can, we could keep playing that, but I think that sets the stage a little bit here. I mean, look, these voters, they sound pretty bad, Ryan. I mean, I think we could take all of these things individually, take them apart, but maybe just to sort of set us up. I mean, is that a fair and accurate picture of rural America, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, I want to thank the white guys in suits in New York talking bad about the white rural people. Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of generalizations there. I don't know where to begin. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
the overall posture, I mean, sorry, Dave, but like the thing that bugs me is just like, this is like, how do we pathologize voters? Right? Like, what sort of different pathologies here? And all these different things cited, like conspiracy theories, racism. Like, I can point to examples of, suburban Republicans, for one, or even big city, like tech liberals. Like, some of the things I've heard out of, like, Silicon Valley type liberals in San Francisco are as fascist and dehumanizing as anything I've heard.
Sorry, guys, you broke up. I might be having internet issues. It froze again. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I'll just keep it going there, though, Matt. Like, I mean, I think that, like, if we, like, we can sort of zero in on this book, though, right? Because I think one of the fundamental issues here is, like, all right, they make their arguments there. It's like sort of what you expect. It's like rural voters are bad, right? Because they're racist. Rural voters are bad because they don't believe in democracy. One of the things that was really shocking about this book, and Ryan, you spent some time with it, was just seeing how many academics who were cited in this book. All these academics coming out and saying, like, hey, the way I was cited in this book is completely inaccurate to what to what it is that I wrote. There was a really great op-ed in Politico, where one of the authors of a very big book on rural America, The Rural Voter, came out and was pointing at all of these things, particularly the authoritarian and the conspiracy theory allegations that they make there. That this isn't based in any kind of real, scientific analysis of society. It's just vibes.
Yeah, not only that, but they take so many opinion polls and as the basis of their the way that they think of rural voters. Like, they cite all sorts of polls that are like, okay, these rural voters think that Trump is good and that democracy is bad. And I mean, the problem with all these opinion polls is oftentimes it is the way that they're stated. And you also have very limited sample size in some of these. But the way that the authors talk about these polls, it's that these rural voters might think of an issue that way. They might say they advocate violence, but they use that to equate that with violence, like to say that the rural voters are on the verge of violence, but just based on the opinion polls, or say January 6th, not any other actual evidence.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, one of the polls that I think that they used to justify to levy their allegation of authoritarian tendencies in rural America had, I think, 12 responders from rural America. I mean, it's the kind of thing that no editor, serious editor, would let get by in a kind of op-ed, let alone an entire book from a major publisher.
Yeah, it's sort of dizzying. I mean, they do cite a lot of statistics, but, you can be kind of overwhelmed and then just sort of, take that as gospel. But then when you actually look at some of the statistics behind it, they're cherry picking so many examples, right? And then take this very broad conclusions based on cherry picked facts and figures.
Yeah, and I mean, so, like, help us set the stage a little bit too, because I think that massive. What is the political viability of this kind of fantasy? Because before we started recording, we were sort of talking about this, and it's just like we've seen a bunch of versions of this argument from the MSNBC crowd for a long while now. I mean, what is the point of sort of like demonizing this group of voters and, having such a need to sort of fudge the numbers so it fits this narrative?
I apologize again. It froze up midway through your question.
No worries. I was just saying, what is the need? What is the kind of political need from these folks, from liberals, from this MSNBC crowd, to create this kind of boogeyman narrative of the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a long history of this throughout American political history, but I'd say in modern times, you especially saw it after the election of Bush, of George H.W. Bush. You saw these kinds of books and these kind of arguments proliferate during that time. They're like, oh, this idiot Texan, and we're going to blame the rural voter for Bushism. And so, you know, I think like a pretty decent version of this argument was like Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas? But it keeps getting revived over and over because, I mean, I think that, you know, in their defense, there's a lot of us that like to have an enemy to go after, right? We want some force, you know, to blame. And I think it's just easy for, I mean, the thing is like for a lot of these liberal elites and you know, that they relate more to some of these very conservative politicians that are taking advantage of voters, more so than the people themselves. So they want to blame the voters for the acts that their leaders that they're voting for are doing.
Yeah, sorry.
I noticed on that, you know, this Paul, what is his name? Paul, was it Waldman? I was curious what he said about J.D. Vance. And to his credit, he tweeted in 2021, like, I don't know how this J.D. Vance guy got so popular. It's all just nothing observations. And then it's like, I wonder if you read the Washington Post review where it said, like, maybe excuse me, ended their review saying, maybe J.D. Vance did this by stop blaming other people and trying to solve problems himself. Basically just giving hook, line, and sinker the J.D. Vance sort of line. And it's like, it's not a surprise because, you know, he trafficked along lines that you guys control, basically, the mainstream media.
You know, what really is the need here to sort of demonize rural America for these folks at MSNBC and the authors of White Rural Rage?
I just think that, you know, for a long time in America, it's been politically useful to blame voters for the problems that are going on in America, instead of the politicians that they vote for. I mean, that's been going on for, you know, as long as America's existed. But, you know, especially since the election of George H.W. Bush, we've seen this argument come out more in liberal media. You know, people desire a scapegoat, right? To blame for the problems. And for a lot of urban liberals, especially, it's easy to take down this sort of abstraction. Because, I mean, part of the issue is that there's not a lot of mixing. You know, you talk about flyover country, and there's not a lot of interaction between rural people and urban people. So they become just this easy scapegoat, you know. The dumb hick. There was an article I remember from 2016 after Trump got elected, because there was a lot of rage against rural voters after Trump, and it was called "The Dumb Hicks Are the Biggest Threat to America." Well, and a lot of what this book is sort of a more articulate version of that article.
You know, I mean, one thing you can note, for example, like horror movies in America. I mean, what is like the most popular setting for a horror movie? It's like going through rural America, right? That's where bad things happen. And I do think this is actually a really important point here, is that like for rural America and the rural voter, you know, this is a group that is generally mediated because, you know, rural America is a smaller part of the population. Geographically isolated from the rest of the country. So there is this mediation, meaning like the media is going there through movies, television, music, and these kind of segments, deciding what the rural experience is, what the rural mind is, all these kind of things. And it's very rare to actually get somebody on, you know, on these kind of programs who has a real deep understanding of rural America. It's oftentimes these kind of rural whisperers. And they are either of the Republican variety, which says, oh, well, rural America loves Republicans because they're the real America and we're the real American political party. Or the other version of it, which is like, hey, rural Americans don't like us progressives because we are so progressive. massive. That it's a big problem. I think that this geographic and mediation problem is huge in sort of crafting this narrative.
Yeah, and what often happens is these journalists will come to rural America and we'll cherry pick examples, right? I mean, for instance, last week, I live in rural Pennsylvania, and I was at the Capitol in Harrisburg, and there was a guy who handed me a flyer that was saying that they're going to reorganize the Pennsylvania militia, right? And that they're going to get rid of the Fed. Now, he was one of dozens of people that I've talked to that have pretty normal politics, right? But, if I was a journalist, that would be red meat for me. I'd be like, okay, I met this guy who, was relatively harmless. He was actually in a wheelchair. So it's not like he was going to go take over the government or anything like that. But he handed me this flyer, and I could be like, oh, God, look at rural America. They're going to start this militia, whatever. But that is a way that the media often cherry picks anecdotes to make this threat seem bigger than it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I think 100%, this situation is sort of amplified. It'd be like going to New York City and, talking to a wild guy in the subway who's telling you about the lost tribes of Israel and being like, all right, the urban voter, we got to figure out what's going on with them.
Yeah, and a lot of conservatives do the exact same thing, but reversed, where they'll take trips on the subway, or they'll walk the streets of certain neighborhoods and say, oh, this is what you get in blue liberal America. And so it happens to both sides, but is completely cherry picked. And, I think you see that a lot in this book, where they'll run into a guy who wants to take over, the White House, or, wants to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, and then try to make that person emblematic of all of rural America.
But there's no doubt about it. I mean, rural America has been going heavy for Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump is extremely popular in rural America. If we want to sort of, we can spend a lot of time sort of debunking all the myths of rural America. But I think a more interesting question, the reason that these things get so much oxygen is people are like, why? Because, the vast majority of American history, geography has played a big role, predominantly regionally. The South voted a certain way and the North voted a certain way. The West, throughout different parts of history, that was something that's very determinative. Now, rural voters in Maine are voting the same way as rural voters in Mississippi. And that's a significant political shift. That's why this part of the country, which is smaller in population than ever before, does have a lot of influence in American politics, because there's a kind of block voting that's happening.
Yeah, and I think that is probably the strongest part of the book. I mean, they spend a lot of time, they spend at least a chapter talking about, the Electoral College and the role that it's played. And, just the fact that the Senate, you have an equal amount of representation in Wyoming as in California, considering California is 100 times bigger. I think that is a fair case to make. But they just go too far in using, that example to say that these rural voters. I mean, the other interesting thing is they talk about rural Americans' mythic power. I found that a weird thing to talk about. We were sort of talking about how often the redneck, the hick is demonized in media, but for some reason they in their minds, I guess all shows are sort of like Yellowstone, where you have this noble, rural guy who, you know what I mean? I guess the Ford F-150 commercials, those kind of guys.
Mm-hmm.
Two data points before your question, David. I just want to remind folks that, this is what the county by county donors looked like for, this is 2020. and they had to run another map excluding Bernie Sanders because he's just crushing every rural area there. But also, it's not just Bernie. It's to the explicit a charge that these are all racist voters. Obama won 43% of rural voters in 2008 compared to 34% for Hillary Clinton. So I mean, maybe it's clearly misogyny. That's not where I would start, though.
Yeah, I mean, what would your response be to somebody who wants to sort of, note that rural America is becoming more and more and more Republican? Is it that because let me put someone on the table here, and I don't want to get everyone in trouble, but the book that everyone always wants to talk about on the left when it comes to rural America is Thomas Frank's What's the Matter with Kansas, right? Thomas Frank's a good guy, I respect him a lot, but what is the argument in that book? Is that the rural voters don't understand their interests, they don't understand their economic interests, and they're just distracted by culture war, red meat. And which is, again, you wouldn't say the same thing about blue voters in California or blue voters in New York. And the fact is that, if you want to make the argument that rural voters are just sort of bamboozled by questions of culture war politics, you have to be able to make the affirmative case that rural voters care more about these issues than other voters. And I haven't seen that established by books like this or other literature on rural America.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Rube argument is that, they do outline a lot of the economic and social problems there is in rural America. And they talk about how it's literally shrinking, and, you have a combination of opioid overdoses, deaths of despair, suicide, and a lot of it stemming from the way that America's manufacturing base that favored a lot of these communities went away, and that rural America suffered the most from it. But, again, they do a good job of presenting it, but then they say, well, these Republican politicians pander to them and promise to restore, Trump did with coal. We're going to bring the old, coal plants back. We're going to give you your old manufacturing jobs back. And it didn't really happen. The arguments want to say that the rural voter should know better, and they should organize themselves and pick a candidate that will actually do good. But the problem is that you could use that argument for, again, urban voters who, politicians of all stripes promise things and don't deliver. And so to blame that person in voting is, I just think a sort of a simple-minded mistake.
100%. I agree totally. But also I think that, there's an aspect that's it's not a small thing that Donald Trump was talking about NAFTA and outsourcing of jobs from the United States. We can all agree, that Donald Trump has no real intention to fight for the common man in this country. But look, when he's running against Hillary Clinton, whose husband, did this to folks, it's not that irrational. To see why somebody might actually understand their interests as opposing, for example, the NAFTA, the party.
Yeah, I think on one hand, you have a party that mostly ignores you or, talks about your white supremacy or your privilege, or you have the party that panders to you and promises things. So, I can understand why a lot of those rural voters went Republican. Do I agree with them? Not always necessarily, but if you look at what they're actually delivering to rural America, there hasn't been a big difference between the parties over the last generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that this sort of gets, to the conversation that these folks are trying to ignore. Because again, just like for the Republicans, they get to say rural voter likes us because we're the real American party. Progressives, liberals get to say rural voters don't like us because we're super progressive and, good and we have morals and, the other folks don't. When the reality at the end of the day is that you have two parties that are very uninterested in doing very much for everyday folks. And the Republicans have seen that it's to their advantage to sort of play up a certain kind of image to show up in these communities. While the Democratic Party, not only, in my opinion, isn't showing up in the terms of like campaigning or even running people for office in a lot of parts of rural America, it's actually to their political benefit to point at rural America as the problems, by like, you know, in the sense of like juxtaposition. It's like, oh, I mean, what was the Hillary Clinton line after she lost in 2016? I won the part of the country that is representative of 2/3 of GDP. He, Donald Trump won the part of the country that is looking backwards, right? So it's not even just that, like, you know what I mean? It's like for the Democratic Party, there's an aspect of it too that, like, to play to their base in the urban America, they actually have to shit on rural America too.
Yeah, like I said, a convenient scapegoat. You know, are you going to blame? I mean, obviously, like, you can say Mitch McConnell is fake and stuff like that, but like, there are so many Democratic politicians that are fake. Come on, so many of them are lying to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's and again, when it comes to rural America, this is not something this is something that has been happening for multiple election cycles. Like, as we noted, Barack Obama wins in 2008 by significant numbers in rural America, does very well in rural America. And it was a precipitous decline, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020. It was like, Trump made a difference. Let's not, recognize that. We need to recognize that. But this was something that was going on within the Democratic Party, for a decade plus, this kind of rightward shift.
Yeah, and like, one thing you don't really hear about, that you didn't really hear about during the Obama years, was that he had, a good amount of rural support. There was just this narrative that was popular among the Democratic elite that, oh, this is a part of this new Democratic majority, that the young, the urban, the college educated are going to have a permanent majority, and that the rural America is part of what was being left behind. And I think for a lot of liberals, they haven't really got past that mentality.
And, there's a lot of resentment that comes in rural America, right? Because there's an aspect, of just like I think the economic case, which I think is pretty easy to make about the poverty in rural America. But there's also just a kind of genuine fear that, like, that lifestyle might not be around for your children. And it doesn't always have to be, the sad story, right? Of, like a family basically going broke. It just means that, like, basically, your rural farming community might be like a vacation destination now. And it makes more sense to rent out your property than to sort of utilize it in the way that it might have been used over the past 100 years, right? Like, there's a genuine kind of resentment and worry about the economic changes, both on like the level of, people losing their jobs, factories closing, that kind of aspect. And people need to remember that, like, rural America is like where a lot of American manufacturing got done in the 20th century. There's also a fear that, like, that world is sort of disappearing. And these are communities that are extremely tight knit for the most part.
Yeah. And I think that, even a lot of liberals sort of glorify getting out of the city, getting into the country. And, I think a lot of us see less dense spaces and the country is sort of getting back to our roots, or getting out of the sort of busyness and the corruption of the big city. But often that the liberal class just goes parachutes in, to have their barn weddings and things like that, and then you go back and this is a rural place that I think Democrats have a hard time talking about, is Selma, Alabama. Selma is interesting. It's very rural. I think a town of about 20,000 now. It's almost all black. It's I think something like 88% black. The Democrats go there every year to talk about the civil rights movement, and they'll send Kamala Harris to the Edward Pettus Bridge. But if you go into Selma itself, it has been totally decimated by a lot of the same forces that's hit a lot of rural America. And so it's so awkward, at times, because like Obama will come, everybody will come to Selma, and they talk about the 60s, but they don't talk about what's happened since then in a lot of these rural places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, it's really dangerous to see how little the Democratic Party has been interested in changing this dynamic, because I want to be very clear to people, at least on my end. The argument is not that like the Republicans are so strong and they're really fighting for rural America. It's like, for the most part, they're the only party that's showing up, and basically what we get is this kind of demonization from the Democratic Party. Of rural America, which again only maintains this cycle. Rural America is like a big part of the Republican coalition right now. I think you cited in your piece, correct me if I'm wrong, what was it, 19% of Trump's vote? I mean, those are significant like populations. Just looking at, works on rural America, a book called The Rural Voter by Nicholas Jacobs and Daniel Shea. These are similar populations to like young people and black people for the Democratic Party, right? And for me, it's just politically absurd to not want to try to tap in to that vote at all on the Democratic Party side. If it is a significant portion of the Republican Party, why is it that the Democratic Party just is so uninterested in even playing ball at this point?
Yeah, it seems like they're just sort of writing them off, instead of like trying to invest in those places and think about, hey, maybe there's something we can do to sort of narrow the gaps a little bit. There's like, well, they're dead to us. Yeah.
I mean, stories about, because the thing about rural America that I find to be really fascinating is that, the arguments about, high rates of like evangelical Christianity, for example, evangelical Christianity isn't even the dominant form of Christianity in rural America. What's going on in rural America when it comes to churches? Churches are closing down across the board. The kind of ownership of certain kind of conservative politics, right? Which those conservative politics, I live in Austin, Texas. I could find plenty of people down the road from me, right? And Austin's a liberal city or whatever, but there are super right-wing churches, very close by to me. There are people who sort of hold on, who are like the kind of person who might have been somebody showing up, for example, at a Jan 6 or something like that. And yet, when you see somebody, sort of represented in media, right, who might be on a Daily Show segment or something like that, and they might have an accent or something like that, that is rural America. That is the rural voter, without any kind of, follow-up or investigation as to whether or not that's true. And what it's allowed, I think, in a really dangerous and sloppy way, liberals and leftists to do is to sort of put all of, right-wing politics, be they about the economy or be they about social issues, and sort of pin that up to the rural, on like rural America, instead of investigating the reality of these kind of opinions in suburban and very much so in urban America.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think part of the reason that Marjorie Taylor Greene is such a good punching bag for the Democrats, because to her that she embodies this sort of like loud, crude hick, that is, she lambasts the elites, and so she like has a sort of stereotype of Here's the thing about Marjorie Taylor Greene. She doesn't live in rural America. She lives in an Atlanta suburb. Atlanta suburb where like there's a ton of, it's very urban. It's called Cumming, Georgia. It is not rural America. So she like is part of this sort of suburban coalition of Republicans, but people just assume that she's like a small town hick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that sort of, I think that's a perfect point, right, Ryan? I mean, this is exactly, I think, one of the fundamental issues here is that perception oftentimes is way more important than reality. And look, MSNBC, like, I won't speak for you, Ryan. I think we might agree on this. I'm not particularly interested in like fixing MSNBC or in like helping out Chuck Schumer, all these folks. What does bother me about this is I see like leftists and socialists sometimes sort of fall into the same kind of traps in how they're thinking about rural America without sort of recognizing that there is now a kind of media industry on the liberal Democratic Party side that is set up to sort of tell you, hey, by the way, no, we shouldn't be trying to do class politics in rural America, right? We shouldn't be trying to do Bernie Sanders style politics because what that means is basically working with anti-democracy, authoritarian, racist white people. And that's just, I think, is suicidal to our political project if people start to incorporate that idea.
Yeah, and I think that having, lived in a lot of different places in the South and in rural America, I think that there's like opportunities. I mean, I canvassed for Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, and having conversations with people in Iowa, I think a lot of people, there's just a lot of us, I mean, even a lot of liberals that haven't had really good substantive conversations about the issues. And I think a lot of people in rural America, once you actually talk to them about what their political values are, they're not that different than a lot of people on the left. But I mean, oftentimes that we're in bubbles and it is true that Fox News and a lot of conservative media is powerful in these areas. So you do kind of have to go beyond that. A lot of it is good face-to-face conversations, but I find that a lot of rural America are open to, stronger unions, which is something that doesn't really get talked about in that book, by the way. Unions and capitalism are words that you will not find very often in White Rural Rage.
Yeah, I mean, is that tremendously surprising? No. Well, Ryan, I really appreciate you spending some time with us. People should definitely read the piece, White Rural Rage is Shallow, Pandering to Elitist Liberals. Ryan, tell people where they can follow you and keep up with your work.
Sure. Ryan Zickgraf on Twitter. And again, you can find me in the pages of Jacobin Magazine and Compact Magazine.
Well, hell yeah. I really appreciate speaking with you, friend.
All right. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks, Ryan.
Welcome back, everybody. It was nice having Ryan on the program.
Absolutely. Talking about our, am I still here?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. It was great talking to Ryan.
Yeah, man. I mean, there'll be more stuff hopefully coming from me on rural America. I've been thinking about the subject a lot, as gathered from the interview. But we're going to go over the post game in just a minute, where we have some fun Crowder stuff. Before we get there, Matt, I want to talk to you a little bit about this Red Lobster story.
Yeah, so I'll just give you my sort of overview of it, not having done the deep dive. But at first, it looked like, Red Lobster not doing well, and there's been scapegoated people who took advantage of their shrimp deal, and then I saw. I'll just leave it there without getting into my other things, because I take it that that's not the full. It wasn't just Americans love a deal too much.
It's so good. This is such a great story because it really does just fit a certain kind of narrative. Just headline, Red Lobster's filed for bankruptcy. That doesn't necessarily mean all going away. But a lot of people showed up to work and the doors were locked. And we'll talk about what that means for folks. But yeah, no, there's been a lot of talk about Red Lobster and particularly shrimp. And the thing is that, one of the kind of easy answers for this has been Red Lobster's endless shrimp promotion, which they used to do just a few times a year, and they made it permanent. And people were like, oh, well, people just ate too much shrimp in it and bankrupted the company. But again, it's one of those things that's always amazing when folks say this kind of thing, because have we lost our American dynamism? We've been loving shrimp forever, as this Red Lobster commercial from the 80s attests to.
We know how you love shrimp. A great deal of shrimp. Whoa, what a deal.
You know, the worry that Red Lobster basically learned the hard way that Americans love a good deal and shrimp is just frankly ludicrous. Don't get me wrong. The endless shrimp promotion that they did cause them a lot of trouble, but it's a little bit more actually interesting than just a bad pitch by somebody.
Yeah, and I must say, I did see some nasty stuff about people bringing large families and letting more than one person eat on the unlimited shrimp thing that I thought was a little bit, you know, I mean, we already talked about Daniel Perry, so I don't want to go deep into that, but coming from a pretty negative place, yeah.
If we get into this culture stuff, Matt, we'll never go forward. But like anytime something like this happens, right wingers love to do this kind of like the nasty mob, right? But I'll tell you another group that loves to do this shit is like comfy liberals. Oh, I never eat at a place like Red Lobster. You know, I prefer to go to my like special restaurant that's very nice and fancy. You know, it's a very nasty kind of hatred of like the people. Look, Red Lobster
Right.
is a part of the the American culture. It's a part of the American experience. We'll put it that. I'm not saying it's necessarily, you know, the embodiment of all that we want to see and be. But there is this kind of really nasty hatred of like the plebs that happens anytime a story like this breaks.
Oh yeah, very much so. And I was having this conversation with someone else. Like, places like Olive Garden or Red Lobster were sort of like the celebration destinations growing up, and you know that's not maybe relatable to like fancier people, but that was like, oh crap, you like graduated. Let's go out to one of these places, and you know they become a part of the community. There's this woman who wrote a review of Olive Garden when it expanded to Grand Forks, North Dakota, and everyone made fun of it because it's like somebody getting really excited about an Olive Garden coming to town, but we didn't have one in town before, and now we got one. And yeah, you know, that's where you celebrate with your closest loved ones, you know, very regularly.
And you know, I think people should definitely read this full story here in Business Insider, "The Fishy Death of Red Lobster" by Emily Stewart, and we'll quote a couple times from here. But again, this kind of hyperfixation on the all-you-can-eat shrimp thing really does, you know, cover up a lot of issues. Quoting from the piece here, while Red Lobster increased traffic somewhat, we're talking about the promotion. People coming in to chow down on all-you-can-eat shrimp was a money bleeder. The company blamed Endless Shrimp for its $11 million losses in the third quarter of 2023. And the fourth quarter, the picture got even worse, with the restaurant chain seeing $12.5 million in operating losses. So the shrimp was a problem, but it is not what ended up sinking Red Lobster. To get that, we have to sort of zoom back a little bit, and we're about to meet a very familiar character in these stories of beloved American icons getting eaten up. That's called private equity. But back in 20,
Oh, the guys who come in and make sure businesses run really well and everyone and serve the community.
you're about to hear some big brain business here. So in 2014, Red Lobster is sold to a private equity firm called Golden Gate Capital. And they brought in these, you know, fancy folks who came up with a lot of great ideas to, you know, really energize the Red Lobster portfolio. One of those was selling all the dirt underneath the Red Lobster restaurants to another company, so that the private equity firm, which bought the company for $2.1 billion from Darden Group, could recoup their losses. And this is what always happens with these private equity firms. They get a bunch of debt to purchase the company, and then they have a lot of debt that they got to pay. So they bleed the company dry to make sure that they're taken care of. And then look, they're fine. They've made money on the process. These companies and the people who work for them, not so much. So they sell the land underneath all these Red Lobsters all across the United States, and they start leasing the restaurants, meaning that all these restaurants now have to pay rent on top of the other expenses like food sourcing, wages, etc.
Leverage buyouts, you know, just to drive that home. It's like if somebody came in and said, "Hey, Matt, I'll give you $75,000 to have your place on Left Reckoning." I'd be like, nice, bet. Come on in, you're in here. And all of a sudden that person comes in and say, "Hey, David, we need to make $75,000 plus dollars because I just gave it to Matt to get myself in here." It's just like a regular part of this is again how Toys R Us famously went under too. And it's also like if I'm like, "Hey, David, also, by the way, there's a new expense coming out of the Left Reckoning pocketbook for rent. And the rent is the studio here.
This new company that I made up, right? This new company that I made up, you owe me rent. It's truly amazing. And look, if it was just, you could maybe even just stop this story there. But it doesn't even get to the fullness of just like the epitome of American financial capitalism. Because what happens next is, okay, so they're now, sort of screwing the company over. Red Lobster is a brand that's sort of on the decline. It's not, as Donald Trump would say, a hot food restaurant anymore. So they're in a little bit of trouble, and this private equity firm brings in a new group called Thai Union, which is a Thailand-based seafood company, and they bring them in for $575 million. And let me just pull up this from this piece because truly, what we're about to get here is something else because there are so many hands in this pot at this time. What we're watching happen right now with Red Lobster, it becomes a little hard to follow. So I'm just going to read this directly from this Business Insider piece. After the real estate move, Golden Gate sold 25% of the company in 2016 to Thai Union, a Thailand seafood company, for $575 million, and unloaded the rest of the company to an investor group called the Seafood Alliance, of which
they sound like superheroes.
Of which Thai Union was a part of in 2020. Right, it's a lot of hands in the pot now. Golden Gate likely came out ahead. Same can't be said for Thai Union, which also controls the Chicken of the Sea brand. A Chicken of the Sea, for our younger
Jessica
audience, is a company that was made famous by Texan Jessica Simpson back in the 2000s for this bit right here.
Is this chicken what I have, or is this fish? I know it's tuna, but it says chicken by the sea. That's stupid.
Honestly, I will say after watching that again,
I love his outfit too, because that is how I was dressing in the mid 2000s. Just like this sleeveless
Nick Lachey, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, interesting time. The mid 2000s, but
the Iraq War.
Oh shit, the Iraq War waging. But anyway, so Thai Union is getting into all this kind of stuff. They own the Chicken of the Sea. They're also basically like a seafood company. And this is where things get really wild here. In 2021, Red Lobster refinanced its debt with one of its new lenders being Fortress Investment Group, an investment management group and private equity firm. According to Bloomberg, it's one of the key lenders involved in the debt negotiations. Now, look, we don't have the time nor the patience to untangle this entire web here. But basically, I just want people to know, in 2014, the company gets taken over by a private equity firm, which then involves all of these different figures, and it causes a lot of problems for this beloved American institution. In recent years, the company has been just running through CEOs because everyone, I guess, gets to take the helm, looks around, is like, oh shit, I got to abandon ship. And there's effectively no leadership in the company. And as people have said in this Business Insider piece and a lot of business analysts time and time again, the commitment, giving people an endless shrimp deal, right, which again did lose money, is not really just like a bad idea. It was a desperate Hail Mary hope that maybe this would reinvigorate the company.
Right.
Funniest thing, and in doing research for this story, Matt, I was able to discover a new news source, which I will be following. Seafoodsource.com noted Red Lobster files for bankruptcy, says investigating Thai Union's undue influence in shrimp purchasing decisions. Because if it wasn't bad enough, all this other stuff that we were talking about here, one of the problems was that one of the now ousted, and I'm sorry, I have not paid for the membership at Seafood Source, but we got them right here. One of the now ousted CEOs of Red Lobster was apparently coordinating with Thai Union under the guise of a, quote, quality review. They made a series of decisions that eliminated the company's breaded shrimp suppliers, leaving Thai Union, right, the company that has a lot of influence over the company, with an exclusive deal that led to higher costs for Red Lobster. So again, going back to the original claim that it was the endless shrimp deal that undid Red Lobster, it's a bit more complicated. We have the story of private equity getting involved, doing a boneheaded move to basically literally take the ground underneath the company away. And then the new wonderful leaders from Thailand came up with an exclusive, bizarre, and extremely lucrative for their company deal to be the exclusive supplier of shrimp to Red Lobster, a cost to the Red Lobster Corporation that ended up costing them so much money, they've now filed for bankruptcy.
I can't get over the idea that Red Lobster is investigating something like a competitor, they're all of a sudden like private eyes in addition to a business that's going under.
Well, truly, I mean, and if I were more interested and involved, I would be curious to see how important these shrimp contracts were for Thai Union, because that is, sorry, not to be, not to do a pun, but like it's fishy.
Oh, wow. I mean, the government should have the authority to like go look into this. Like, it shouldn't be on Red Lobster. It should be like we've hired some private detective, some gumshoes to try to work on the case. Like, this should be very easy to actually look into. But it's like it's so incestuous. Like Thai Union buying the Harvest Alliance, like all these different like groups of like just parasites, just people that their entire life isn't like actually putting in work. It's how can we set up some sort of system where the money flows right into my pockets more directly?
And I'll tell you this: is that did any of this create like real serious innovation in seafood? No, like the technology that we needed existed in the 80s to meet America's shrimp fix. Now, look, we're having a little bit of fun here, but this is serious. I mean, a lot of people lost their jobs all across the country, and this brings us back, I think, to the most important point here. It's ridiculous when you look under the hood of American capitalism and you see all of these bizarre maneuvers and techniques being used by private equity firms, by vultures and vampires to try to squeeze every last bit of profit out of all these companies. And while all those people get their money and are fine, take care of themselves, moving on to the next project, moving on to the next thing that they're going to strangle and destroy, it's thousands of American workers who are left in a difficult situation. And this is a local news report from Denver. And I just find what this woman says in this clip to just be an incredible embodiment of the unfairness of our system, because a bunch of jackasses in San Francisco screwed over the company by selling the ground underneath it. Some weird Thai company started creating, I don't know, seemingly, I don't know for sure, but seemingly corrupt breaded shrimp deals with Red Lobster. And the consequence is this woman and lots of other people lose their job. So let's just play this right here.
Boguski didn't find out until about 2 hours before her shift on Monday when her phone was lighting up with texts.
I thought somebody died. And so I panicked and I'm like, what's happening?
When she checked her schedule, she says there was no longer anything there. Her job as a server was gone without any notice from the company. She says everyone from servers to managers couldn't believe it.
Nobody acted like they knew anything. Like if they did, nobody knew.
In a statement from the Colorado Restaurant Association, President Sonia Riggs says restaurants across the state are facing labor shortages, unprecedented inflation, high interest rates, and increased regulations, saying that this year we're seeing local restaurants close every week. Boguski, now a victim of one of those closures, just wishes she and her coworkers had more notice.
You can literally open your eyes, go about one morning, go about your day, check your phone, and then your entire livelihood is gone. And that was someone else's decision. And that's terrifying.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the point. Is that, something that massively affects your life. You don't have control over that. Hell, let alone control over it. Just fair warning or notice about it.
You don't know that your boss's boss has decided to literally rent the ground from under you to another shell company. And all of a sudden, you don't have a place to like go get money to pay your goddamn rent at the end of the day. I mean, it is really is, it's a brutal display of this system.
Which is inherently anti-democratic and absurd, that the people who get taken care of first are the dumbasses who sunk this company into the ground.
Seafood Alliance or whoever the fuck. All these companies.
Those are the ones who get taken care of, and the actual people whose work or what create, the value at these companies are the ones who get a text.
Who sweat in the kitchen, who clean the bathrooms, who like clean up your goddamn food you mushed into the carpet. No, it's these guys at the Seafood Alliance, and they get people in suits being like, hey, you know how we could, I mean, it is so despicable.
And in a rational and just system, as long as folks wanted to continue to eat Red Lobster or seafood, what would happen in a situation like this would be that those people who create that business would be able to take it over, continue serving the community, continue maintaining their jobs. But instead, we just have destruction and suffering for no reason, but just make sure that number goes up for the folks at the top.
Yeah. I mean, under that system, look, if each individual workplace decides, hey, maybe we should rent out the ground from under our feet to a shell company, they could do that on a worker run restaurant by worker run restaurant. You wouldn't have some goddamn egghead being like, I think this is a good idea, and bankrupting the whole country, the whole company.
Well, folks, that is Left Reckoning 170. Show's not over, though. Matt and I are going to jump right over to the post game. You can get access to that at patreon.com/Left Reckoning. A lot of really exciting stuff, including the post game, but also our bonus episodes. We had a really great conversation with Nick Bolin over the weekend, talking about Big Sky, Montana, which is another kind of example of these bizarre companies that are taking over things that should belong to the people. In this case, how a bunch of billionaires are basically creating their own little fiefdoms out in Montana. So you won't want to miss that. You get access to that patreon.com/Left Reckoning and help support the program.
See you, folks. Oh, also Steven Crowder talking about the ICC being gay. Interesting theme, a through line in Steven Crowder's coverage from his very first video, it turns out. But anyway, see you in a few minutes over the postgame. Patreon.com/Left Reckoning. Come on, folks. We want you to join. Come on.
There we go.
Hey, come on. Come join us over here, Jack. See you in a little bit.